Hello everybody, my name is Anton Treuer and I teach Ojibwe, language, history, and culture. And today I'm going to share a perspective about Thanksgiving. Holiday season's upon us and a lot of people have the question, how do Native Americans celebrate, or do they celebrate this holiday? So the first thing I need to share is that I live in a house full of Native people and I don't even know what they're thinking most of the time. I can only represent myself and my own view and perspective on this important chapter in history. I'll give you a little bit of historical background and then I'll share a little bit about what I do with my family. First of all, the Thanksgiving narrative that most Americans know, it has been highly distorted. There were pilgrims who came to what's now the northeast part of the United States. First arrived in 1622. There is no evidence of a joint native pilgrim harvest celebration or anything that would resemble that until 1637. So that's 15 years after the first arrival. So the idea that the pilgrims came, the natives saved them, and they celebrated and broke bread together ever since is a little bit mythological. There were interactions from the very first arrival of the very first pilgrims, and they were not always, military or adversarial. Pilgrims did show up. They had a pretty tough first winter. And it is true that Squanto and other native people from the Wampanoag and neighboring tribes did try to befriend the pilgrims, did share food with them, and shared indigenous knowledge about indigenous farming practices and so forth. But you have to remember, this land was, there were a lot of native people who were living there. So the pilgrims who arrived were not occupying a vacant wilderness with a couple scattered bands of roaming nomads. There were people there. And when the pilgrims came and set up their villages, they were displacing native people from their land. So while native people didn't try to wipe them out, they didn't feel too great about these people starting to try to push them away from their own land and their own villages and resources and things like that. In spite of that, a lot of native people tried to put their best foot forward in sharing resources and knowledge, and there was a period of relative peace. And then, especially with the Wampanoag, who were first contact tribe with many of the pilgrim groups, there was a long-standing effort to create and maintain peaceful relations. In spite of that, the pilgrim population grew dramatically. By the time you get to 1675, there are about 90 British pilgrim villages in what's now the northeast part of the United States. 90 villages, lots of people. And so they weren't just trying to displace people from a little part of the land, they were trying to push people out of a huge swath of territory. Eventually, one of the preeminent Wampanoag chiefs that the British colonists called King Philip was trying to maintain peaceful relations, and violence erupted. The conflict was brutal. The Pilgrims had previously attacked the Narragansett. They had attacked, the Pequot, neighbors to the Wampanoag, and then eventually conflict erupted with the Wampanoag as well. There's a lot, and I won't go into the details of all of that conflict. To some of these tribes, the conflict was genocidal, the majority of the population being killed. And King Philip himself was killed by the British. He was decapitated, and his head was placed on a pike at the village of Plymouth, where it stayed for 20 years in a row. His wife and children were sold into slavery and sent to the Caribbean to work on a British sugarcane plantation until they died. The first story of Thanksgiving was kind of complex. Now, to today, and how do Native people understand this history and deal with the holiday and things like that, I think you'll find different people handle it in different ways. For some, it's a day of mourning. For some, it's a day of remembrance. And for some, it's a day of Thanksgiving. So I'll tell you two things. One is, at the village of Plymouth, every year, the descendants of the Pilgrims who had first settled there and perpetrated a lot of violence on the native communities meet with the descendants of the Wampanoag and other neighboring tribes, and they call their gathering a day of commemoration, where they remember, commemorate the history, knowing that it is complex and conjures mixed feelings for both. That effort has been helpful for the descendants of the first pilgrims to arrive in navigating feelings of guilt and shame that sometimes come up about this troubling period of history. It's helpful for the native community in that they can grapple with the painful memories and knowledge of what happened to many of their ancestors, and the fact that they now own a tiny postage stamp of property surrounded by a sea of non-native people. For me, with my family, I get a few days off from work. Kids are coming back from college and getting a break from school and things like that. And so we do gather. We too try to commemorate and have mindfulness about this chapter in history, but we also try to give thanks for the things that we are grateful for, the company of one another, our lives, and the opportunity to try to make the world a better place. In my view, all of the things that we strive for, that most people care about, happiness and so forth, it's not a destination that we get to, it's just something we practice at. We practice at being happy. And some days we do better than others, but if we keep practicing, we do become happier. We practice at gratitude, and some days we do better than others. But as we practice gratitude, we become more grateful. You can't go to the gym once in your life and have a really great workout and then you're done. You have to keep practicing to get stronger and so forth. And so we don't get to healed by skipping all the healing. We don't get to reconciled by skipping all the reconciliation. And so I do think that the holiday offers an opportunity for all of us, of all backgrounds, to both take an honest look at the history and think about what it means in our own lives. Thanks for watching today. Miigwech.